gentlemen, Graeme Holm here, aka Australia's original money mentor, and it's an absolute pleasure as always each week to introduce you to the brilliant Dr. Andrew Wilson. I won't cover off his credentials. Most of you by now should know who he is and the amount of weight, his accreditations and his experience. He's definitely well versed as a talking head in the industry, and his knowledge, his degrees, his accreditation cover all of that. So let's not muck around. Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And good morning, Doc. Ho, ho, ho. Merry Grinchmas on behalf of the mainstream media in Australia. I thought I'd join the bandwagon of the clickbait and give everyone a bit of a Merry Grinchmas today with you.
Oh, come on, Graeme. You know, that's not like you. Seriously. I mean,
it's not like me at all.
Yeah, we're the purveyors of truth and justice and, you know, all the good things in life. So,
well, if nothing else, everybody will see a silly photo of me with you all suited up and think, oh, what's this nonsense he's on about now? This is unusual.
Well, you know, Christmas only comes once a year, and we're here at Christmas.
Well, you know what might come once a year?
What?
Some good news. Some facts, because we've heard a lot of rubbish and grinchy material and clickbait all year. So I'm pretty excited for today, Doc. It's been a big year in the Australian economy and the property market.
Well, it has, Graeme. It's been a topsy-turvy year, roller coaster ride, all those sort of sayings. And we started off with a boom, the end of a boom, and it ran out of steam. And so it should have, because it was such a strong boom. And then, of course, the markets were knocked on their head by the first interest rate increases in more than 10 years. And, of course, there was plenty of fertile ground there for doom and gloom and negativity, and the plenty of predictions of house price crashes as usual. And we seemed to shrug that off pretty quickly, though, really. And by the time we'd moved into the spring selling season, it had actually become the spring selling season, you know. And we've had a very resilient and responsive spring selling season this year. And it's just sort of worked its way into the holiday period, which I guess we're in now, we are in now, Graeme, because last weekend was the final auction weekend of the year. And now we're all waiting with bated breath, not really, until the market starts again in February. So we'll have a nice rest and ponder the outcomes. But I guess we had to have one, what we could say, bad year after all the good years we've had in a row. If this is a bad year, well, you know, as we'll see with the latest data, Graeme, which is exclusive to the podcast today, we have the latest data, which is the 2022 calendar year data for house prices. It won't change very, very much because there's not a lot of data to come back in. And so we can actually take the scoreboard.
Well, this is interesting, Doc, for those that are sitting beneath the scoreboard all year and waiting to see what goes up on the board, because we've heard secret RBA papers to show up to 20% that actually predicted 11 where Sydney and Melbourne nearly got to. But then we've heard other areas like Adelaide that's absolutely booming throughout the year, consistent week on week, month on month.
Yeah.
And then, you know, Southeast Queensland, I mean, Brisbane, Gold Coast really were the leaders throughout the year. Really, last year, this year defied any potential downturn. They've settled down now, but I mean, I'd be interested for everyone that's playing along at home. Who thinks we had 20% drops? What do you reckon, Doc? 20%? 10%?
Bit of a way off there.
Let's just go back, Doc. What's the largest ever decline we've ever had in the last 35, 40 years?
Well, we've spoken about this, of course, Graeme, when we were speculating on how markets would end up this year. And the worst result we had was 5.5%. That was a fall in the national house price, and that's measured from December quarter to December quarter. And that was over 2018, which was a similar period to this year in so much as that we had a lot of negative press. And, of course, that affected buyer and seller activity. We had the fear of being involved. Impacting markets, and buyers and sellers did sit on their hands through 2018, and that resulted in a national fall of 5.5%. And that's the worst that we've recorded in the modern era, Graeme. So how have we gone this year? Well, we'll find out shortly, I think.
Let's not give it away just yet. We want them to pay attention. I wonder if we're over. If anyone's having a little play along at home, are we over that 5.5%, the worst we've had, or are we under? I bet you, Doc, I reckon the average consumer tuning is saying we'd have to be over. Melbourne and Sydney were down 8, 9, 10%, over the course of the year already. So we've got to be, if not worse or equally as bad as we were. So play along at home, write down now, where do you think we ended up? Over the worst we've had of 5.5, as Doc said, or under? I'm curious. What do you think? I don't want to give it away, Doc. I don't want to give it away. It's absolutely terrible, by the way, everyone.
Yes, it's very exciting, isn't it, Graeme? But
it's as exciting as my pom-pom here, Doc.
Well, we don't want to undermine the credibility of all those that have joined the group and forecast cataclysmic falls in house prices this year. So we want to have a look and see just what the actual results are nationally. Of course, there are mixed results, but we'll have a look at the capital city breakdowns as well. But I think what's very important when we do digest these numbers, Graeme, is that we compare them to what we experienced last year. So we can look at our net 2-year result in terms of house price growth. And I don't think even the worst doomsayers were predicting that we'd fall as much as we gained over the last year or so. But, well, some of them did. And we'll see how those forecasts turned out.
Well, let's do that, Doc. Let's jump into the data. Let's not keep everyone waiting.
Yes, Graeme, it's some exciting times, and maybe we'll start with but by doing first of all our national economic update. It is the last one for the year, Graeme. Of course, we are in the holiday season now, but let's start off with having an overview of just how our Australian economy is performing. And Graeme, it's still booming. Last week, of course, we had the latest unemployment data that was released by the ABS. Another record low. Are we getting sick of saying this? 3.4% unemployment rate seasonally adjusted. That was the same over November as it was over October. As we keep saying, this is a record low monthly rate. It's the lowest rate since the early 70s, where we used to take a quarterly survey, not a monthly survey. So it's as low as it was back in the days or in the early 70s when we used to take those quarterly surveys, not the monthly surveys. But for monthly surveys, it's a record all-time low. And that's really a remarkable number, Graeme. And we just have to look back not that long ago where, the 5% were what we were expecting, 5% plus as our unemployment rate. And now, look, we're way down at these record low levels. And all our states, it's not as though there's one particular state that's pushing down or a couple of states that are pushing down the national unemployment rate. All the states are enjoying these boom time conditions, very tight labour markets, in the threes everywhere except South Australia. And they're all well down on where they were a year ago, Graeme. So that's the improvement over the past 12 months. 12 months ago, we were pretty happy with those 4% unemployment rates. And I think we were discussing, the perhaps likelihood that would be the bottom of the unemployment cycle. But we've pulled it down more than 1% since then. So,
and Doc, just for the people tuning in at home to really understand this year, what do the RBA, the government, the powers that be, where do they like the range of unemployment to sit typically? To be stable?
They want unemployment to be as low as possible, Graeme, but they also want inflation to be between their target range. And for underlying inflation, that's between 2 and 3%. So it's great to have low unemployment, but we need to have low inflation as well. And, of course, jobs growth. So we've got sort of half the equation working for us at the moment, Graeme, with very, very low unemployment, which is great news because it means everybody basically who wants a job can get a job. There's plenty of competition for labour out there. So, people are being pestered by employers saying, come and work for us, will you? We'll give you an extra this or an extra that. So it's good times, for workers in the Australian economy. In terms of that strong demand for their labour, of course, we do have high inflation. which means that we've got to pay more for our goods and services, which is absorbing those wage increases. So certainly not a perfect world, Graeme. But in terms of having jobs, which I think really is the starting point for any economy, we're doing as well in our labour market really as we've ever done before. And when we compare it to the early 70s, Graeme, it was a different Australia in those days. It was about really single income earners, households. Now we have a lot more depth and breadth to our labour markets, more people involved, more workers involved. And, again, that sort of reiterates just how strong these conditions are. Again,
that's a good point, Doc. It very much was the single income household back then. I'm not being sexist or facetious.
No.
But,
it was.
Dad was out working. Yeah. If, mum and dad with a family, very heterosexual and standardized here, but dad was out working and mum was raising young children until they sort of got to school age or a bit more. And typically mum may re-enter the workforce. Now, is it safe to say or sad to say those days have gone? Is it, Sydney, Melbourne, Houseprey, even Brisbane now, it's a bit tough for one family to want to hold a mortgage.
Oh, absolutely.
Have mum or dad at home and only one income coming in. I think it's sad or safe to say, I think those days may be gone.
Well, I think there was a duality here between economic circumstances and I guess sociological circumstances, which have brought particularly females into the workforce, which is a good thing. I mean, as you said, Graeme, it'd be very difficult to support a typical household now on one income. So, we've moved from one income to 1.5 incomes to perhaps now more about two incomes supporting families. And it's not just the economic drive, the economic need to have more income. It's also the change in our, society, our sociological view of, what is a career and who should participate in careers in terms of the breakdown in males and females. And look, that's a good thing. And again, reinforces the strength of our economy that we can have such a low unemployment rate with the capacity to be employing, a much broader spectrum of our society in our workforce. So the jobless was steady over at 3.4% over November. Graeme, still the lowest monthly result on record. We actually had some more good news that jobs increased by 64,000 over the month, which is a really good result. The best actually job increase we've had since June. So we're still finding more jobs in our economy, Graeme, which is really good. So maybe there's even some downside or upside in terms of a lower unemployment rate going forward below that.
That's interesting, Doc, because, we were hearing the dirty R word earlier.
Yeah.
The recession, all these sorts of things this year in the clickbait, lamestream media.
Yes.
But when you look at it, we're actually creating jobs and industries who go, oh, no, there's a tech bubble, there's a this bubble, there's a housing crash, people are getting made redundant. But people have created 64,000 jobs in the month.
Yeah, best since June, Graeme. So, again, we can't be pointing to perhaps finding the bottom of this very tight labour market. The signs are that it's still growing. And, of course, the participation rate, which measures the proportion of our workforce out of our population, is still at a record high. So we've got, we've dragged people out of the population that normally wouldn't have been engaged in the workforce, perhaps those that have retired, self-employed. They're now back into the workforce or in the workforce, and we have that record high participation rate. So
that's interesting, Doc. 3.4%.
Yeah.
Call it 70%. So effectively 1%, right? 30% of that 3.4 aren't really looking for work for whatever reason.
Well, this is right, Graeme. And we've basically got the trifecta here, in terms of, having a strong or describing a strong labour market, and that is a record low unemployment rate. We've got jobs rising at the fastest rate in nearly 6 months. And we've got the highest proportion of our population actually engaged in the workforce. So there are no holes in this data. It's just tick, tick, tick. in terms of just really reflecting what is, in terms of the jobs market, certainly a booming economy.
I was going to say, Doc, all we're missing there was tick, 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 boom.
Yeah.
We were close.
Well, I got there. But, and the other point is that it's a very consistent result across all our states, Graeme. They've all got low unemployment rates. It was interesting when we looked at those state comparisons that the Western Australia wasn't that far away from where it was a year ago, but a year ago it was in the threes too. So it was a very, very strong performance last year. It still is, but now it shows that the state performances are evening up, and that's just another reflection of just how strong our economy is. So we've got record low unemployment rate, jobs increasing at the fastest rate in 6 months, the participation rate at a record high. All our states are taking advantage or are part of this very strong economic performance.
So, Doc, that then brings, and there's no rate of slowdown, that then really brings us to, well, you know what else will affect this? Migration.
Well, that's right, Graeme. And as you just mentioned there's really no sign yet that the higher interest rates have impacted our economy, no real signs. And the real signs will come from higher unemployment. And that's the game plan here for the Reserve Bank. They have to start, people have to stop spending to get prices down, basically. And how do you stop spending? What's the biggest motivation? Well, basically, it's when you lose your job. And we don't want to see that. We don't want to get back to those early 90s days when we whacked up interest rates nearly into the 20s, and we had double-figure unemployment rates coming along behind those high interest rates when we did move into an economic downturn. So, there's just no sign yet that interest rates are impacting our economy. No real signs, certainly no signs coming out of the labour market. But as you said, Graeme, we also had some other data out last week, which again reinforces to some degree the strength of our economy. And of course, that was a surge in migration. The ABS reported the June quarter data for migration, which is the latest data, and it showed, not surprisingly, we all know this is occurring, another surge in migration. And if we look at net migration within all the states, the major states here, Graeme, and this is the difference between people leaving the country and coming into the country, you can see how that incredible rebound is continuing now from the COVID lockdowns. Of course, we shut our borders. Nobody came in, basically. And now we've opened our borders and bang, they're all coming back in droves.
That's interesting, Doc. I mean, Queensland,
yes,
obviously clearly leading the way, but look at Victoria's rebound.
Yeah. It's just tracking, obviously, at the strongest rate. And of course, we know Victoria has traditionally, and when we look back in that cycle there, and Victoria is the black cycle, you can see how high and how strong migration was through 2015 to 17 in Victoria. In fact, it reached record levels. And that was part of what was driving certainly a home price boom in Victoria, in Melbourne, in those during those years. And
it's interesting as well, sorry, Doc, that we've been working together for several years now, and throughout COVID, we went digital very quickly and kept, telling the truth and providing the data. And we've got ourselves on video over the last year saying, although Melbourne is, more locked down than pretty much any city in the world, and it's having an economic crisis at the moment, we're both on the record stating we believe that it will have one of the most significant economic rebounds.
Yes.
Because after every dip, there is that growth, that rebound. And look at what's happening. People are flocking there again.
And look,
they also did leave, but people are flocking there again.
And that's the point. It's gone from being, the worst performer clearly in terms of net migration through COVID. And now over the June quarter period, it's only behind Queensland in terms of the growth in net migration. And it will certainly catch Queensland quite quickly, Graeme. Victoria is a very migrant-friendly state politically. That's fine. It is a strong driver of economic activity. I still think the Melbourne housing market has some catch-up to do. in terms of its COVID experience. I still think there's still some pent-up demand in that Melbourne market, but it'll certainly be accelerated by the surge in migration heading for the southern capital. Now, the government's, we'll just have a look before we talk about that, at the interstate migration scenario. So this is, we know there's been some big shifts in interstate migration. So this is net quarterly interstate migration, Graeme. So this is the difference between people moving out of a state and into a state. You can see how strong Queensland was during the March quarter this year, over the year to the March quarter, the March quarter itself. And of course, we've discussed how that was a response to lockdowns, that the severe Melbourne lockdowns particularly drove a lot of new migrants into southeast Queensland, and that certainly pushed up prices on the Gold Coast in Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast. But when we look at the latest data, Graeme, we can see no surprise that the level of net migration, interstate migration into Queensland is easing. Of course, we're still at record levels, but it's the end of the lockdown impact, or the strong lockdown impact, and you can see that the net loss out of New South Wales and Victoria is also declining. So, and that's the story, that lockdowns are finished. COVID is not the issue it was, thankfully, as it was last year. And as a result, that shift is starting to decline. Now, we've seen that impacting Brisbane and Gold Coast house prices, particularly Brisbane, because they don't have the surge, or Brisbane doesn't have the surge from cashed up interstate southerners, buying houses and units. So no surprise there. But it's interesting also that we've seen net migration falling in South Australia and Western Australia as well, Graeme. And they were also states, capital cities, Adelaide and Perth, that did take advantage of that sort of COVID refugee factor and did support their housing markets through that period. But the real story, Graeme, is that firstly, that of course the quarterly migration is up sharply again. All states recorded steep increases in net migration, which of course is positive news both for the economy, but will increase demand for housing. The interstate migration is lower in Queensland, but it's still high, and lower also in South Australia and Western Australia. But the rate of decline has eased in Victoria and New South Wales as the issues over COVID have now eased. The government has announced a target of 195,000 migrants for this financial year, Graeme. That's a lot of migrants, mate. And, there's plenty of stories around that there's maybe even 1 million applications for visas they're waiting to be.
And it really supports, and I think we let 90,000 in a quarter, maybe, didn't we? 80, 90,000? Yeah. Can't remember. Well, a big number.
And there's a lot more to come. And the problem is with the migration position, Graeme, that the stories of 1 million, up to 1 million applications to come and live in Australia, and they can't be processed because we can't find enough people to go through them because there's so many of them.
Well, I did a TikTok on this the other day about this aspirational target, and I got some interesting comments from the barbecue mafia. Well, in India, it's like 5 to 6 people per house, and and it's only interest rates that drive property markets up and down in Australia. And I'm thinking, how naive of people, or how uneducated. Like, realistically, we're actually shrunk the average amount of people per dwelling in Australia. It's not the 3 or 4 it used to be. It's much lower now. There's less people per dwelling.
Sorry, mate, you go.
200,000 migrants, and we're aspiring to provide 200, but we've already got a rental vacancy of pretty much nil.
That's right.
Nil.
Yep.
So that's not going to help our local market. It would be, if we got there, it'd barely cover the migrant, and we've already got a crisis. So I cannot see interest rates playing that much effect at all. It's lack of supply and phenomenal demand.
Well, I guess that's going to be the solution for those that are trying to offset the logicality of the, undersupply, too much demand, not enough supply, by saying we're going to squeeze more people into what we've got, existing, and therefore that'll moderate rental growth and prices growth. Well, it's not working so far, Graeme.
No.
It's, and I think that it will be one of the, the results of the supply crisis that we do have, particularly in our rental markets, that we will see people having to share households, because we're still seeing, rents now, they've eased over the last few weeks, which we'll look at shortly because of the usual end-of-year effect. But rents in Sydney are still rising. House rents in Sydney nearly up to $700 a week. There's no lack of demand for rental properties. And, of course, we know unit rents have gone through the roof because one of the factors there is that people are looking for a more affordable option because they can't afford to rent houses anymore, right? That's one of the, I guess, consequences of a shutdown or shutout rental market is that people will have to start looking to share households because they can't afford single household, particularly rental accommodation. But that's at the margin, Graeme. We're only talking, that's not going to affect rents, it's not going to affect vacancy rates. And if you think about it, when we're talking about migration, Graeme, if we've got 1 million applications for people to come and live in Australia, and we're going to take 200,000 of those, well, 4 out of 5 are going to be, sorry, come back next year. So it gives us a lot of choices as to the quality of our migrants that are coming in. Yeah. And that reflects their skills and their wealth backgrounds. So I'm not sure they'll be the type that'll be looking to share households, even though that might create that.
No, I thought I'd get in a debate in the comments on. I thought, I'm going to leave this alone. You can't argue with silly, so I'll just leave it.
It's an interesting comment, Graeme, but it is going to be one of the consequences, but not as a result. It won't be, as I said, the more applicants we have for residency in Australia, the more, and with that limit of 195,000, which is a pretty high amount regardless, the more choices we have, and I guess the more we can direct it to what we need to sustain our very strong economy at the moment. But we certainly need migrants to help ease those skills shortages in this very tight labour market. But there's no doubt, Graeme, no doubt at all, that this surge in migration will place upward pressure on prices and rents in undersupplied housing markets, which is really basically everywhere.
Now, rates are still going to play a factor, but it's not the main contributing factor.
Well, rates just make it more or less affordable to purchase a property, which, makes sense because most of us or most of the market is generated by those that will secure a mortgage as part of their purchase process, right? So rates are important in terms of affordability. And, it's typical that higher rates mean that we're doing better in a sense, and that reflects inflation. And then it gets to the point where we're doing too well, so we have to get even higher rates. Lower rates is usually bad news because it means we need to stimulate an underperforming economy. But at the end of the day, if you've got to live somewhere, Graeme, and we are one of the richest nations on the planet, and, we find a way, don't we, to find accommodation for ourselves through our economic cycles. So is the rate outlook improving? Well, there's some factors over the last week that have given us an indication of that. The US and the UK both increased their December rates by 0.5%, Graeme. Now, that's lower than the 0.75% which was their previous rise. So they've starting to track back on the rate of increase of their interest rates. They are worried about weakening economic activity. A lot of chat about the UK and the US moving into a recession. That'll actually have a positive effect on us in the shorter term, Graeme, well, particularly our interest rate scenario, because a weakening international economy will help, will certainly reduce demand for our exports. And that will mean, again, we will have a reduced economic capacity, which will hopefully work its way into impacting the case for higher interest rates from our Reserve Bank. So we're getting a little bit of a help downwards, remembering the big picture is we're trying to put on the brakes here. So we'll get a little bit of a help putting on the brakes from recessions if they occur, or certainly downturns in economic activity when they occur in the international economy next year. And of course, the real issue here, which is a conundrum, is that governments are wary of the lagged effect of higher rates. That's why they're starting to talk a little bit sideways now, because they're worried that if they keep raising rates, and because there's no sign of it having an impact, that all of a sudden it will have an impact and they'll have trouble, trying to reinflate the economy as it starts to decline. But inflation is lower, basically because oil prices are falling, but there is some signs there that we may have reached the peak or be close to the peak of our headline inflation. But of course, it's underlying inflation, that 2 to 3% range that the Reserve Bank is aiming for. But the Reserve Bank in its latest minutes said that it's still years away, it believes, from getting that 2 to 3% target underway. But the fact that there is that lagged effect means, Graeme, that rates are now more likely to pause early in 2023. And most central bank governors are saying, we might give it a bit of a rest just to see how things are working out before we move on again, because we're a little worried that because of the lagged effect, we might not be picking up the impact as yet of a slowing economy. So we just want to maybe give it a little bit of a wait and see approach. And the Reserve Bank has also said in its latest minutes, Graeme, that one of its options is to keep the cash rate unchanged for a period while it assesses the state of the economy and the inflation outlook. So things are a little better there going forward in terms of the outlook for interest rates and inflation.
As long as they don't ignore their own statement and then apologise for it in a couple of months' time. We'll see. That would be a low act if they did that, Doc.
Anyway, drum roll, Graeme.
All right.
Here's our big announcement for the day.
How bad are we? We're playing along at home. Minus 20, minus 10, minus 5, plus 10. What do you think, boys and girls, from the Grinch, from Grinchmas this year? What do we got, Doc?
Well, this is the annual calendar year home prices. So we've got enough data now, Graeme, to produce a robust result. So this is the December quarter annual house and unit prices for this year, obviously. And we're going to compare it with what happened over the December quarter last year, which we do remember. And we have to take the quarters into context. Last year, we were still in boom time conditions over the December quarter. So, although it was starting to ease, but it was still strong conditions. And this year, we've come through a weaker period in the market through winter, through higher rates and just lower affordability. And we've actually now started to pick up, and the markets have certainly picked up over spring. So that's the context of the quarters. But when we look at the year on year, certainly we can say that we've had positive results for 2022, particularly given the negative sentiments that we've had and expectations, which are still there, that we'd have a sharp decline in activity and house prices.
So we're looking positive for what we're about to see, Doc.
Well, it's positive in relation to what was predicted, Graeme. So working the work. So this is the results over the year. So we've only had two markets that have fallen over the five major capitals, and that was Sydney and Melbourne. Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth have recorded positive growth this year. Perth has ended up the year as the strongest market over the 12-month period. As we mentioned, Brisbane's now starting to feel the effects of that reduced surge in interstate migration, particularly from cashed-up southerners. But the national result, Graeme, was 3.7%. So as we discussed at the beginning of the show, the worst result we've ever had was 5.5% in 2018. We then had two other results during previous downturns of 4%. So this is actually the best decline that we've ever recorded.
Well, on that note, no more Grinch then, Doc.
So I think we can call that, in terms of a surge, a remarkable, unprecedented surge in interest rates, the first rise in interest rates in over 10 years, despite coming from a once-in-a-generation house price boom that, we've only declined nationally by 3.7% over the year for houses. So I think that's a pretty positive result, Graeme. No sign of a 10% plus decline there in house prices, which were predicted by many. Of course, they will use different measurements to justify that, peak to trough, etc., monthly results, etc. But this is the data point that the Australian Bureau of Statistics use. This is the methodology that the Australian Bureau of Statistics uses. This is, I guess, what the umpire says in terms of using measures for house prices. So we're using exactly the same here that the government statistician uses, and we've come up with 3.7%.
We're not using the media's measurement stick here. We're using the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the umpire's chair.
Yeah, that's right. And as I said, this is, and you'll find that most of the measures will come out around about this. So, and I think the other interesting point, Graeme, is, and I don't want a big note here, but this is pretty close to what we've been predicting for the last 6 months, if you think about it.
It is, Doc. Going back through the presentations we do together each month that you provide to our community, you're pretty much bang on.
Yeah, I think we nailed it pretty much. Probably Brisbane was a bit of an underperformer in Adelaide, and they came back to the field a little bit over the back end of the market, but of the year. But Sydney and Melbourne actually improved. So, horses for courses. And Perth was probably a little better than we thought. Yeah. But overall, it's just about on the money, I think, for what we were predicting. So, interestingly enough, Graeme, units, as they've been outperforming houses in the rental market.
I was about to say I'll hold on to my hat, but I've thrown it away because it's not Grinchy. Units, hang on. Units are terrible, and body corporate and dramas and units outperform houses.
Yeah, this year. So let's have a look at the unit story. Again, similar to what we saw in for houses in terms of the state performances. But the decline in Sydney was certainly not as severe as the decline for houses. But look how strong Brisbane and Adelaide were, Graeme, over the year in terms of the growth in unit prices. I think that's the big story there. The Brisbane market, no surprise.
And interestingly enough, Doc, Sydney units held on a lot stronger than Sydney homes.
Yeah, that's right. And again, that's a lot to do with that under supply of property. That it's we're now seeing a real drive towards even more unit living in Sydney, which is traditionally has the highest proportion of units versus houses of any of the capital city markets. But that's driving, not just the culture of higher density living, but also the affordability advantages of higher density living, pushing Sydney-siders back into the unit market, even during a period of higher interest rates. And I think what we're finally seeing, and this will be validated next year, Graeme, is the end of all that building that occurred in Sydney for units. I think that's all been absorbed now. It's the problem is finding, enough development sites and enough finance perhaps to undertake more development to satisfy the demand. And of course, Graeme, this is before even we've had the real impact of migration on the market, which will affect typically units more than it affects houses. But big result there for Brisbane units and Adelaide, up each around about 10%. So let's have a look at this year versus last year, Graeme. We've had a couple of negatives there in terms of Sydney and Melbourne. Now let's have a look at what happened last year. Holy moly, look at this. So when we look at 2021, we saw Sydney up by 32.9%. Okay, we're down 9.2%. That leaves us still with a lot of equity in our property over the last 2 years if you're a Sydney-sider for a house. Same story in Melbourne. But look at Brisbane there. Brisbane's up 35% over the last 2 years. Again, that's that drive from the interstate migration. And Adelaide also, which did also have an advantage from interstate migration, it's up over 30% over the last 2 years as well, Graeme. So, overall, some very, very strong results there. And Perth, who's been an underperformer for quite some time, it's up over 20% over the past 2 years and had the leading result annually over 2022. So let's have a look at where all the prices ended up. Median prices, no surprise, Sydney's still number one in terms of the median house price, well ahead of everybody else there. And same story for units there, well ahead of units. So let's put it all together into a little story, Graeme. Only Sydney and Melbourne reported home price falls over 2022. Despite those falls, Sydney prices remained 23.7% higher over the past 2 years, with Melbourne up 17%. Units outperformed houses for prices growth over the year. National house prices fell by 3.7% over 2022, which is the lowest of all the declines that Australia has recorded in the National Capital City house price series in the modern era. Those predictions of 10% plus falls in house prices in 2022 were obviously well off the mark. And certainly markets are set to record positive growth generally in 2023 as rate rises ease, as we've seen recently, and migration surges. And housing markets generally have finished the year in a positive sense, Graeme, with monthly price declines easing in Melbourne and Sydney and prices continuing to grow in the other capital city markets. So we're well set up to start 2023 on the front foot, Graeme, and the signs are positive that the drags on house price activity or house prices and housing market activity is starting to ease, and we have some very positive forces that are likely to continue to push prices and rents up next year. And why should we be surprised? And I think the other point is that when this data starts, the real data starts to permeate consumer mindsets, they'll also now start to believe that it was all a lot of BS.
And we will just continue to get on with it as Aussie households do.
And those will be, I guess, to some degree, patting themselves on the back that have taken the plunge and got into the market.
Well, I mean, Doc, if you didn't do anything from some of those media articles a couple of years ago in Sydney or Melbourne, you're still down. You're still priced out of the. If you were buying a 500 grand unit in Sydney, it's now up 100 grand.
That's right.
And if you're in Melbourne, it's up nearly 100 grand. So, trying to save 100 grand net of tax in just 2 years, you can't do it.
No, it's
guys. There's a core message here with the data Doc's giving you. Those who sit on the fence lose. Those who play the game and get a result.
And Graeme, it's almost tiresome because we've been saying this cycle after cycle after cycle.
You made me choke on my water, Doc. It's true. How you've got to, it's a long-term approach, and over the long term, medium people are doing well.
And that it gets so tiresome, doesn't it? Does it? But
I'm gonna have to wear a helmet next year if I hear this crap in the media again.
I think next year's storylines won't revolve around crashing house prices. They'll revolve around, well, they will probably, but they'll revolve around the force of an economic downturn. Because as soon as we start to get a sense of higher unemployment, and that's the Reserve Bank's game here, is to get unemployment up, because it knows that's the key to really curing inflation. But the minute we see unemployment reversing, the unemployment rate reversing, even though it's at remarkably low levels, and even though it has to happen because of all this migration we're bringing in, that's when we'll start to get, the usual clickbaiters invading the media with their predictions again of 10% plus falls in house prices. And again, all those usual suspects, all the usual clickbaiters will be wrong. But they get their result, which is the attention of the media. Now, I'm not so sure that, and that's probably what spring has proven this year, that as many are taking notice of what the media and, their clickbaiters are telling them, as an example, as they did back in 2018 in similar circumstances. And certainly we performed a lot better this year than we did in 2018, and we've revived certainly a lot quicker. So I guess it's like the boy who cried wolf, Graeme. You keep saying it, you keep trying to, make that scary headline, and eventually people just ignore you. And that's the jeopardy for the media here is, what's going to happen to their credibility when they, can continue to be revealed. Their headlines continue to be revealed as being, just designed for short-term attention without any real credibility to it, So we move on. So let's finish off, Graeme, after that wonderful event. Let's finish off with our usual update for what's happened. And this will be the final one for the year because we're all going to be hunkering down under the Christmas tree shortly, waiting for the jolly fat man to do his thing. And so this will be the last one for the year until that occurs. Latest data, this is the daily data over the past week, how we finished off over the week. Prices are a little higher, interestingly, in Sydney for houses, but the effect generally at the end of the year, Graeme, is that we see, and these are listing prices, by the way. What we were looking at before is the official sale, not official sale prices, but sale prices. These are asking prices from sellers, other than the sale prices we saw in the previous data set. But this is covers the whole market. But we did see a little bit of an uptick in house prices in Sydney and Melbourne over the past week. That can tend to reflect the mix of prices or properties in the market. But typically we will start to see lower prices coming through. And one of the main factors there is that we see fewer higher priced houses in the market now, Graeme, as they tend to be more the seasonal activists. They're the ones who come into the market in autumn and in spring. So, seasonal effects starting to impact house prices and unit prices. Similarly, with rents, we see Sydney's rents just eased over the past week, again, because there's less demand, less activity in our rental markets. No surprise there, seasonal activity affecting our asking rents.
A bit of a market shutdown for the next 3 or 4 weeks, though.
Yeah, absolutely, Graeme. And that's what we expect. And look, we all need it, don't we? A little bit of a break.
Yeah.
But churning out, ready to churn out next year's scenarios. So we had the final auction results for the year last weekend, final weekend auction results. Again, more solid results. And I think it's interesting to look at the data that we've looked at before in terms of price changes over the year, Graeme. But I think that the latest auction results give us more of a sense of where we actually will be heading next year, because we always take off where we finished the following year from where we finished in the preceding year. And I think you'll find that occurring next year. And there may be some more positive news coming through that will enhance market activity that's been quite positive over the end of the year. So more solid results last weekend. Clearly, markets have revived over spring. Interest rates, auction markets have revised. Interest rates have not had the negative impact that many predicted. Clearance rates in Melbourne and Sydney, and this is an example of what I said before, Graeme. I don't think we've bitten into the media doom and gloom as much as we did back in 2018. And that's a salient message for the media, that maybe they've been crying wolf too much and people are just ignoring it to some degree. But certainly clearance rates in Sydney and Melbourne, which I think validates that, are well above where they were at the end of 2018, where they were at 40%, Graeme. That's where we finished 2018. And I think another interesting point is that when we compare our clearance rates last weekend to the final weekend last year, we've actually narrowed the gap between, obviously, during a stronger market conditions a year ago, but we're not that far away in Sydney and Melbourne now from the clearance rates we were recording a year ago. There's still a gap, but that gap has been narrowing. And I think that shows that we've had less of a seasonal effect this year, and also that our market's holding up, particularly Melbourne and Sydney, over the final part of the year. And certainly the foundation is set for further auction market rise over autumn 2023. Looking forward to that. So clearance rates there still above 60% in Sydney and Melbourne. Seasonal effects, obviously, people are getting distracted, Graeme, particularly buyers. They're going to wait till next year. Auction numbers still held up quite well for the last weekend. These would have been record numbers a couple of years ago, Graeme, in turn. People were sort of saying, look how low those numbers are compared to a year ago. But a year ago, we had an unbelievable surge in auctions because we had all that pent-up supply coming out of COVID lockdowns.
Yep.
We'd never seen numbers like that at the end of the year that we had last year. And when we look even at the numbers this year, they're actually quite strong in the historical record for the final. We're a week away from Christmas, Graeme.
Yeah.
And we're getting hundreds and hundreds of people, in the auction market, and we're still getting a 60% plus clearance rate. Oh, these are very good numbers given the time of the year and the cycle as well. Brisbane down a little bit. Again, these are seasonal impacts, fewer buyers, also Adelaide and Canberra. We look at the monthly auction results. It gives us the full story. Down in winter, up in spring. Spring selling season again coming to the fore. And then, of course, at the end of the year, we start to get buyers more distracted. So clearance rates, as they do every year, started to ease over December. Same story in Melbourne, a bit more consistent Melbourne, but it's certainly revived over spring and just eased over December as it usually does. Brisbane up and down like a yo-yo as usual, but Brisbane's end of the year just where it's been traditionally in terms of its auction clearance rates. But when you look back a year, you can see the impact of that surge in migration on Brisbane clearance rates. They've never seen anything like that, Graeme. To get 80 and 90% clearance rates as they did last year just reflects how strong that market was. But it's more back to a normalised market now in Brisbane of around 50%, but a little lower, of course, because of the seasonal effects. Same thing in Adelaide, which has picked up actually slightly over December compared to November, but well down on its peaks through the earlier spring period. And similar scenario in Canberra, just easing following its spring high. So as usual, Graeme, when I return next year, that's where you can get those auction clearance rates. So it's been an incredibly busy day, hasn't it, Graeme?
It has indeed, but
it's been a big
3.7%, Doc. I mean, how many got it so wrong?
Well, we should be used to it by now, Graeme. It's just Groundhog Day all over again, isn't it?
Right. It's a little bit tiresome. I mean, I'm not going to let it tire us down, but I think for those of you listening along, there's the data. Therein lies the truth. And after every dip or correction, Doc, we see that there's typically the growth rate is substantially higher than what the decline rate was. So I think for most people, Doc, there's a lot of positive outlook coming into the new year.
And Graeme, I think the important points are this, that we've really proved to be a resilient housing market this year. We've had, almost unprecedented increases in interest rates, the first increases in over a decade. We've come out of a once-in-a-generation house price boom, and yet we've picked up over the spring market. So we basically had a 2 or 3 month correction period, which was during winter, and which was typically a quieter part of the market anyway. And we certainly I think it's been a very positive year. And we've come out of it with the best correction we've experienced in the modern era, despite that unprecedented once-in-a-generation boom last year and those unprecedented increases in interest rates. So I think the Australian housing markets have really proven themselves once again. And I think the scene is set. Certainly, it would be a shock for me, not that matters, but nonetheless, if we didn't see a positive year emerging in 2023. In other words, prices will end up higher at the end of 23 and where they ended in 2022. And we're certainly on track to do that with what the latest results are for monthly and daily house prices and home prices, and also what's happening in our weekend auction market. So I look forward to revisiting our blog in the new year, Graeme.
Absolutely.
I wish everybody out there a really great Christmas and a safe and happy holiday season. And we actually will be back pretty soon in the new year, and we're going to have a look at all the regional data, Graeme, and see what's happening in our regional markets. So there's still plenty to talk about.
We might have a look at the holiday data as well.
And the holiday markets, because that's still a strong market during January. Markets such as, the Mornington Peninsula, the Gold Coast is a very active market during those holiday periods. So we'll have plenty of data, and we'll have a look also at how some of the big regions have performed. Newcastle, Wollongong, the Gold Coast and, some of those bigger regional markets have performed over the year as well. So there's always plenty of news in property, Graeme.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. For those devoted listeners at home, Doc and I are on holidays. Our first session back for the new year will be the week leading into Australia Day. So that midweek just before the Australia Day long weekend. So everybody, as Doc said, have a safe, merry, enjoyable festive season. Eat a lot, love a lot, but go into the holiday season knowing 3.7%. Not that bad at all. Positive prospects for the new year. Stay safe, everyone. And as always, thank you, Doc.
Thanks, mate. Good on you.
So if you need help or you need to find out more, go to money-mentor.com.au and use the discount code podcast1500. So instead of $19.97 for a weekend full of experts, economists, financial planners, accountants, asset finance, you name it, then go to money-mentor.com.au, use the discount code podcast1500 and it'll drop it from $19.97 to just $4.97. That's $19.97 to just $4.97.